Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Today we're going to talk about GameCube on the Nintendo Switch 2. I also got that new GameCube controller that you can use with it, so we're going to test out both. Now, GameCube emulation is a new feature for the Switch 2, and it requires you to have the Nintendo Switch Online membership as well as the expansion pack. And so that's the higher tier of Nintendo Switch Online membership. It's $50 a year for an individual account or $80 a year for a family membership. I've been using the basic family membership for many years at this point, which is $35 a year. So it cost me an additional $45 to be able to have Nintendo GameCube here on this console. And also bear in mind that you're not actually buying the games, you're buying the service. So it just allows you to install this one app, which gives you access to some Nintendo GameCube games. And the Switch Online account also gives you access to other systems. For example, at the basic level, you will have NES, Super Nintendo, and Game Boy. Now at the higher level, you'll have Game Boy Advance, Nintendo 64, as well as Sega Genesis. The upgraded pack also comes with some other perks, like the upgraded versions of the Legend of Zelda games for the Nintendo Switch, and it also comes with the Mario Kart 8 Deluxe Booster Pass. Now, I actually bought all these things individually before all of this, and so I'm kind of double dipping right here. Either way, that's how you get set up with playing Nintendo GameCube games on your Nintendo Switch 2. Now, as of making this video, there's only 3 games to play: F-Zero GX, Wind Waker, and Soul Calibur II. It does come with the NTSC and PAL versions, so if you are in Europe and you want to play it in a language other than English, you have that option, but also bear in mind that many of these PAL versions only run at 50 frames per second, as opposed to the NTSC ones, which will run at 60. And so there is a bit of a trade-off, and it really depends on the game. Some of the games actually allow you to choose between 50 and 60 hertz, but you can also see that, the PAL version of Wind Waker has 5 different languages to choose from, which may come in handy. It's also worth noting that these games appear to be a carbon copy of the original. For example, here with Wind Waker, the initial cutscene is super long. It takes forever and you cannot skip it. And same thing here with this version, there is no ability to skip it. Now in the Wind Waker HD version on the Wii U, you could just press start twice and it would skip through. So yeah, it looks like we are definitely playing the original GameCube version, and they have not added some quality of life fixes. Now the first thing I want to talk about are the graphics, because these games have been upscaled, but they're really coy about any sort of information in terms of how much it's been upscaled and what other options that we have. So here we are with Wind Waker, and the first thing you'll notice probably is the aspect ratio. So this is running in that original 4:3. The Wii U version, the HD one, actually was in 16:9 and upscaled to 1080p. Now this is a game that I emulate all the time, but I'm not going to show off emulation in this video for obvious reasons. And just eyeballing it right here, it does look like a 2x resolution upscale or a 960p, basically double of 480p. Now earlier I said I wasn't going to do any GameCube emulation, but Soul Calibur II was a multi-platform game. So this is running on the PlayStation 2 on the Odin 2 portal, and both of these are in widescreen mode, and I'm running this one at a 2x resolution upscale. And based on what I'm seeing right here, it does actually look like the GameCube version is a little bit sharper around the character edges, as well as this door right here. This is a little bit fuzzier. Now I've got a hotkey set to be able to adjust the resolution, so if I go and press start and up, it goes to a 3x integer scale instead. And this one now looks a lot sharper than the GameCube one here. So without knowing the actual specs of what they are upscaling Nintendo GameCube to, it looks to me that it is either a 2x or maybe a 2.5x, somewhere very close to 1080p. Now, even though Wind Waker is locked to a 4:3 aspect ratio, other games like Soul Calibur II and F-Zero GX natively supported widescreen within their settings, so you can actually turn that on within the game. So here with Soul Calibur II, you just need to go down into Options and Display Settings. Within here, there's a screen ratio option, and you can just adjust it to wide, and it'll automatically widen the screen for you. And this will rescale the graphics for you, so it's not going to make the characters especially fat or anything. It's just going to look like how it normally would, but in widescreen. It's a similar setup with F-Zero GX. You just want to go into the Options section, and then within here, there's a Screen Mode option. You can change it to widescreen. That's going to widen everything for you. Just bear in mind that not a lot of games had this widescreen support on the GameCube. I think that Soul Calibur II and F-Zero GX are exceptions to the rule. So I think visually the GameCube games look pretty good. You will be limited to 4:3 with certain games, including Wind Waker, but when you can actually play them in widescreen because it's supported in the game, I think it looks pretty good. I think the graphics could be a little bit sharper. I'm not sure if it's a full 1080p upscale. It looks very close, but there's also a little bit of softness that I'm not used to after emulating these games for years and years. So my guess here is it's a 2x resolution upscale, which still looks very good and much better than the original, but I think it could look a little bit better. Now let's talk about controls. We'll start by talking about the Switch 2 controls when playing GameCube, and then we'll move on to that replica GameCube controller. If we press the menu button at any time, it'll bring up this menu. This will allow us to make a save state, so we can create or load a save state right here. They call it suspend point, and then also we can view and change our controls. And I have to say that right out of the box, the control scheme that they are using is really wonky, and it's pretty typical when you see emulation platforms. They essentially are just following the labels of the buttons as they originally were with the GameCube controller. So in essence, they're using the A button as A button, B as B, X and Y, and so on. But the thing about GameCube in particular is that the button labels do not really match the layout of the buttons compared to the original controller. So looking at the original controller, we've got the A button in the center. This is kind of like your main button. You would use this at any given time, and then you can reach all the other buttons very easily. And so I like to think of the A button as home base, and then all the other buttons are kind of equidistant. The A button is usually confirm, the B button is cancel, much like other Nintendo platforms, but the layout of X and Y are totally different. And so if you look at a one-to-one translation, it doesn't really lay out in the same way. The A button is now your main button, the B button is your cancel button, and then X and Y are up top. So let's take a game like F-Zero as our example. This is going to be your acceleration button, this is your brake button, and then the Y button is your turbo button. So usually when you're playing this game, you press and hold the button here with the bottom of your thumb, and then you tap it here to do your turbo as you're racing. And that's essentially how I like to play F-Zero. It's a very intuitive way of turbo boosting when you want to, and so this makes a lot of sense to me. Now with a Joy-Con, if we just use the default layout, that means that we're going to press and hold the A button to accelerate. Now, that's not the end of the world. It's how it is in like Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, for example, but the turbo button is assigned over here on the left. And so there's no real easy way to be able to hold this with part of your thumb and then only press that one button. It just doesn't make sense with a single finger solution. And so instead, what I often have to do while playing is I take my index finger up above and then I curl it around and then I press that while I'm playing. It's a very unintuitive and kind of uncomfortable way to turbo press. So right off the bat, I don't think it's good to have a one-to-one translation of the button labels. It just doesn't make sense to me. And unfortunately, that's just how it's laid out. You can see the A button is accelerate, and then they have the turbo button, which is the Y button here on the left. And for some reason, they thought this was okay. Now, thankfully, you can change out the controls on a per game basis. It's surprisingly easy to do. All you have to do is go into the change control section, and then each of these can be remapped to whatever you would like. Now, changing the button's a little bit more complicated than you may expect. What you will do is first pick the button you're going to change. We're going to do the button A first, and then it's going to show you a layout of all the different moves that you can do, and you're supposed to pick it from here. And so once it says select the action to set, what we want to do now is look through all the different commands and decide what we want to do with this A button. Now, because this button layout is different than the diamond shape on the Switch 2, you kind of have to be judicious about what you want to change for each game. So with F-Zero in particular, what I want to do is have the A button as my main button, and I also want to easily access a second button to be able to turbo. I don't really use the brake that much. So the way I'm envisioning this is that the B button will be my accelerator, and then the Y button is going to be my turbo boost, so that way I can just kind of hold it like this and then turbo like that. Then if I need to brake, I'll make that the A button. Even though that doesn't match the same layout of the Nintendo GameCube, that seems like a more secondary position. And so since we are trying to assign the A button right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to use air brake and select that. And so now back in the main menu, you will see that it's in red, which means that I've changed it. And it's now saying that this A button is my brake. So the next thing I want to do is change the function of the B button. So I'm going to press A on that one. And now I'm going to go up to accelerate instead. And so at this point, I've just effectively swapped the A and B button. So this is accelerate, this is brake, and then this is still going to be my turbo button. And so for me, this particular layout makes more sense for F-Zero GX, and so this is what I'm going to save it as. Now, one other unique aspect of the GameCube is that we have this Z button here up top, but then also we have analog triggers, which are not present in the Nintendo Switch 2. This means that for many games, there are two different buttons. There's this button where you press it down most of the way, and then another one when you physically click it down even more. So this is the analog input right here. And thankfully, this is still all configured with the L and R buttons up top. So depending on the game and how the Z button as well as the analog triggers function, you should be able to assign them individually to each of the shoulder and trigger buttons. And so it might feel a little bit weird to assign two different buttons to a single button on the original GameCube, but I think that's a fair workaround. Either way, once you've gone through and kind of mapped your individual game, you can press the B button to exit and then you can save it. From there, it's going to map it and save it to your individual profile. And so this is the control scheme that they have set up for F-Zero GX with my slight modification between the acceleration and brake buttons. You can also see that they have assigned the trigger buttons to be the slide mechanic in this game. So if you need to slide left or right, you would just press L2 or R2. I think that makes sense. The Z button originally is what you use for a spin attack, and you can see that they assign this to R1, which is basically the same position as the original Z button, so that makes sense for me too. If you're ever looking at this menu and you want to see what the original buttons were laid out to, you can actually just press the Y button and it'll show you right there. Now let's do another example with Calibur II to show how they really did a number by just following the labels here, instead of really thinking about it intuitively. In the original game, the A button was your horizontal strike. It's kind of like your main sword weapon. The one above it, the Y button, was your vertical version of that. And so you could press it horizontally or vertically, and that made sense geographically. On the right side, we have our kick button, which again makes sense because these are your two primary buttons, but when you need to, you can just hop over to this one. And then finally for B, we have our guard button, which again makes sense to me because you have to pull away from your attack buttons to hit your guard button. All that makes sense. Also on the GameCube, this button did all three of these buttons at once, and then we also used these buttons for guard as well. And so now let's look at how it's laid out by using the labels instead of intuition. This means that your right button is your horizontal strike. I could see that working. However, the kick button is now assigned above, which means that your vertical strike is now on the left. Now your guard is also on the bottom. And so to me, this does not make any intuitive sense. The fact that we have all these buttons to work with, and instead they have it set where this is horizontal, this is vertical, and then this is a kick. And so this is how I've made my adjustment, where I have the horizontal strike here on the bottom, my vertical strike up on top, then my kick, and then my guard. It's not a perfect comparison to the original GameCube, but it makes more intuitive sense to me. All the other button layouts are fine for me. I think they make sense, whereas this one is going to be our Z button, and then these ones are going to be our triggers. So that I don't really have a problem with. It's just these face buttons. They don't make a lot of sense. Now that being said, I'm very thankful that we have the ability to change these on a per button basis. It takes a little bit of time to kind of figure out how you want it all to be laid out, especially when thinking about the original controls, but I love the fact that we have the freedom to change them if we would like. It honestly feels very non-Nintendo to allow us to have this much freedom. Usually, they just pick what we're supposed to want, and then we have to live with it. A good example of a very Nintendo situation is the NES platform on Nintendo Switch Online. What they did here, again, is they just followed the button labels of A and B. So this means that for a game like Mario 3, this is your jump button and this is your run button. If you want to run and jump, you have to press and hold B and then use the A button, kind of shifting your thumb over. And for me, that's a very unintuitive way to use the A and B buttons with these particular games. In fact, Nintendo themselves changed it up with the Super Nintendo. If you remember, with Super Mario All-Stars as well as Mario World, they changed it up so this is the run button and this is the jump button. To me, this makes a lot more intuitive sense. But unfortunately, if we go into the game menus, there is no option to change out the controls. So you were just stuck with that if you wanted to play NES games on Nintendo Switch Online, which to me, I think is kind of a pain. So even though it is annoying to have to go in and change out the controls for certain games to make them match what you actually want to play with, it's great that we can do that in the first place. Here's one last example with Wind Waker. So you can see that I have changed out the layout to basically match the ABXY pattern on the original GameCube, but the cool thing is that you can also change the camera direction. In the original version of Wind Waker, the left and right cameras were opposite, which means that if you wanted the camera to pan left, you had to press right. This was very typical of like the early 2000s. It happened on games like Ratchet & Clank, Jak and Daxter, as well as Wind Waker. You saw it across both PS2 and GameCube. But because we can change each individual button, including our right analog stick, that means that I can actually change it to a more modern, intuitive control scheme. And so now with this setup, I can actually pan the camera to the right and to the left in a more intuitive and modern control scheme. So this is pretty cool that we're able to actually change the camera controls on Wind Waker. I think it would have been even better if they had used the HD version and used some widescreen hacks here, but hey, at least we have the ability to change the camera. Now let's talk about the Nintendo GameCube controller, which you have to buy directly from the company. You also have to be a Nintendo Switch Online member to even buy it in the first place. Now, you don't have to have the expansion pack, because I bought this before I got the expansion pack, but I did have my basic online membership. This will cost you about $65 at the end of the day. It's been sold out here and there, but I was able to pick it up pretty easily. The packaging itself is super simple. We've got like this little plastic layer right here, and then we have the controller itself, and that's it. There's a little bit of plastic here to kind of half halfway cover it, but that's about it. And so this is what it looks like. It's kind of a cross between an original GameCube controller and then the Wavebird, which was the wireless version. By the way, this is my original GameCube controller from 2003 when I first got the system. I picked up the orange model. Unfortunately, I no longer have my original GameCube. I got rid of it after I got the Wii because it could play GameCube discs. That was a terrible decision. But I also kept my original Wavebird. This controller was super cool. You could plug it directly into your GameCube. You would set the channel to be the same between the two here, and then you would just basically have a wireless connection. It used two AA batteries underneath. Unfortunately, this one did not have rumble when you played it wirelessly, but it was a really good wireless controller back in the day when wireless controllers were kind of rare. Now this controller weighs 210 grams, which is kind of amazing because the original controller was also around 210 grams, but this one doesn't have a battery and this one does. So it does have a very authentic kind of heft to it as well. The feeling of the plastic also is very similar, although mine is a little bit more slick, but this thing is, 22 years old. Everything else feels the same. We've got that same mushy D-pad from back in the day, and then our analog sticks feel the same as well. They have that octagonal gate. These are also analog triggers. They do have that click down like the original controller. We've got that Z button. They've also added a ZL button if you ever need to get to it. We've also got all of our typical connection buttons, our home button, our screen capture, as well as the chat button for the Nintendo Switch 2. And this looks like our Bluetooth connection button. The face buttons also feel the same. Overall, I'm actually really impressed with this thing. It gives me some very nostalgic vibes. It feels like playing with a GameCube. Now, unfortunately, there is no information online about the battery size of this controller, and so I'm not really sure how long the battery life is going to be. That's not listed on their website either. They even have an FAQ page and they don't even mention it. So that's probably going to require some long-term use, but if it's anything like some of the other controllers, I would expect maybe 40 hours of gameplay. Now, when it comes to connecting this to a Nintendo Switch 2, you just have to press and hold this connection button that first time. It's going to then pair it with your device, so pretty easy setup. From there, once you've got it paired, all you have to do is press the home button. It will actually wake the device from sleep, so that's pretty great. Now, once you start up a GameCube game and you go into the control menu, it actually will show the GameCube controller layout, which I think is awesome. But you can also go in and still change the controls out here. So, for example, if you want to change out your camera view here without messing with any of these other buttons as they are assigned, this is going to be great. And so again, like with the original control scheme layout, I can change this to rotate in a more modern way. And so here we go. This is a pretty ideal way to play this game. I've got a more modern layout here where I can move the camera in a more intuitive way, but then I'm also using a GameCube controller, which is awesome. Whether or not it's worth $65 to have this kind of arrangement is really going to be up to you, but man, I think this is going to be actually a pretty good fit if we get more GameCube games on this service. And by the way, because we don't have that minus button to bring up the menu, they've assigned it to the ZL button right here. So you can just tap on that. That'll bring you to the regular menu so we can go back to our game selection. So I think this is a pretty ideal setup when it comes to playing Nintendo GameCube. If you're going to use the GameCube controller, it's just going to follow the original mappings, but if you want, you can also assign them specially for the Joy-Cons as well, and it's going to save between the two depending on what you have connected. So once you have it set up initially, where you've got your buttons mapped the way you like, it's all going to be very intuitive. And it's really nice to have the more natural and intuitive controls of an original GameCube controller when playing games like F-Zero GX. And so I think in the future, when I am playing a GameCube game, I am going to use my wireless controller. Now, another game I wanted to try out with this controller is Super Mario 3D All-Stars, which has Super Mario Sunshine on it, which was originally a GameCube game. In that game, you use the right trigger to squirt water. You could press it halfway down and you could run around while squirting, and then if you pressed it all the way down till it clicked, that would allow you to remain stationary while you were shooting the water. And so that was a very intuitive setup, but it's something they changed with Super Mario 3D All-Stars. Because the Nintendo Switch and Switch 2 did not have analog triggers, they set it up differently. So what they have instead is that each of these will do a different function. If you press and hold the trigger button, this is going to be your squirt while running button. And then if you want to remain stationary, you would press the R1 button. That's going to keep you in place while you're squirting. I've always found that to be a little bit unintuitive. I would rather run with this one and then remain stationary with this, but it still works pretty well. It's also worth noting that the button layout that they used with this game makes a lot more sense than it did with the GameCube games we were just testing. For example, in the original game, the A button was the jump button, but in this game, the A button is not the jump button, it's the B button, which I think just makes a lot more sense. Now, you can also jump with this A button. They've actually got it assigned to both, but the nice thing is that the B button is over here, which makes a lot more sense. And so I've always found that the button layout that they used here was more intuitive, especially more than the Nintendo Switch Online GameCube games. So now I've paired my GameCube controller with Super Mario Sunshine, and it actually works perfectly out of the box. This is really surprising to me. So as I'm playing around here, everything makes sense. I can press the A button, it's going to jump. I can press the D button, it's going to dive. I can use the X button here to toggle between my different nozzles. And everything is set up with analog triggers. So if I just press it halfway down, I can run and shoot. But if I press it all the way down, then it's going to remain stationary. So this is actually one of the better reasons to get this controller, in the fact that it works perfectly with Mario Sunshine out of the box. And when I first put my cartridge in the Nintendo Switch 2, there was an update that was waiting for me. So maybe they added the support via that online update. To be honest, when I started this video, I figured that this was not going to work out of the box, and it would be something that I would complain about, that Nintendo kind of half-assed it. But honestly, this is pretty cool. So it may end up being that I play more of Super Mario Sunshine on my Switch 2 than the actual Nintendo Switch Online games, which is kind of funny considering the fact that this one doesn't require an extra subscription as long as you own the game itself. By the way, the GameCube controller will work with other games, including Mario Kart World, and so this is kind of neat as well to be able to play with an old school control scheme, but a more modern game. It's also worth pointing out that this controller does have a rumble motor, which means that it's essentially like the best version of the Wavebird controller out there because it's both wireless and has rumble. It also feels nice and snappy. I'm not detecting any input lag with the Bluetooth connection. Another thing worth noting is these are very console-like controls, so they are extremely clacky like they were back in the day. So you don't have these nice silent buttons here like you may expect with more modern controllers. Instead, yeah, these things are pretty loud. I think at the end of the day, it's probably better to go authentic than to try to change out the buttons and how they feel, but just one thing worth noting in 2025. And then finally, one note about battery life. So this lasted 3 hours and 20 minutes in my testing, which I think is pretty decent considering that, some of the higher end games like Cyberpunk and Mario Kart World do not last more than like 2 hours. So this is kind of middle of the road. So putting it all together, I think the implementation of this GameCube emulation is actually pretty good. There are a couple stumbling blocks. For example, the fact that they have the button labels in a really weird kind of pattern with the Joy-Cons, but thankfully we can at least adjust them within the settings. I also appreciate that we have both regional versions for each of these games, which makes it great for a wider audience. The in-game menu is also pretty decent. I love the fact that we have save states, so I can jump right back to where I was when I start playing a game. And then, like I mentioned before, the ability to change out your controls, both for the GameCube controller as well as your Joy-Cons, is a really good move. Now, there are some things that could be better. For example, it costs $50 a year just to have access to these games. If you're only going to be using Nintendo Switch Online to play Nintendo GameCube games, that is probably not worth it, especially right now with only 3 games to choose from. And so I think in order to make this a better value, we need to wait and see how many more games are added to this platform. I would love to see things like Super Smash Bros. Melee or Mario Sunshine, Eternal Darkness, or Twilight Princess, or the Pikmin games, or maybe even Luigi's Mansion. Like, all of those would be good additions to this platform. So the way I see it, if you are only looking to play Nintendo GameCube games, then $50 a year to just have access to these 3 games is obviously not there. But if you combine that with like additional games as they come out in the future, and then also the ability to have like upgraded versions of the Zelda games on Switch 2, then it might make more sense. I also think that if you are going to dive headfirst into the world of GameCube, picking up this controller for $65 is not that bad of a deal, just because it provides a very authentic experience. And if you're someone like me who really enjoyed playing the original GameCube, then this controller is an excellent fit. This is probably my favorite part of this entire video right here. Now, if I didn't already buy this Nintendo Switch Online in order to make a video about it, I probably would not have bought it on my own. I would have waited a couple years to see how many more games are added, because the longer you wait, the better deal it would be. I could see myself waiting until there's a dozen games available, and then, for $50 a year, I could just plow through all those games at once, and that for me would be a very good deal. Now, I think for me personally, I would rather have these games just listed on the eShop, and then I could buy them, say for $10 or $20 each, but then at least I know I wouldn't have them paired with a subscription service. Instead, they would just be tied to my account. I would much rather buy it like that, like the old Virtual Console on the Wii. And for me, that would be better bang for my buck, because personally, I probably wouldn't buy Soul Calibur 2, but I would absolutely buy F-Zero as well as Wind Waker. At the end of the day, I think that Nintendo GameCube on the Switch 2 shows a lot of promise, but I can't really recommend it right now for $50 a year because 1, you're not owning the games, and 2, there's only 3 games to choose from. So I think in the future, it'll be a better deal, but for right now, it might be better just to wait and see. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and as always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.